So OnePlate, your charity, is also a very beautiful charity. Could you tell us how the idea came to create it? What's the birth story of OnePlate?
Sometimes the wonderful things in life, how things we don't necessarily plan for. It's not necessarily on our dream list, but then something touches our heart and it evolves into something. And that's exactly what happened with OnePlate. I'll just never forget one of the speakers on stage. She was talking about the 145 million orphans around the world. And I remember just sitting in my chair listening to this lady speak and just so completely overwhelmed by that statistic. A lot of these children, we actually encountered these, there were about 10 boys and they were between 8 and 12 years of age, and they were all high on drugs. And I thought they were on drugs because they were involved in crime. But the reason why they're on this drug is to actually numb their stomachs from hunger. That's when I realized that for those children, that's the first time the whole week that they're getting served a meal on a plate. The rest of the week, they're looking for food out of bins or plastic or wherever they can find it. And the plate gives them dignity, but it's one plate and then one more. We don't want to just hand out food packages because that will help the children today, but what about tomorrow? What about next week? How can we really help them long term? This is one of the reasons why our sustainable food projects are more than just food to eat. It's actually, these gardens are nourishing for just not the stomach, but they're nourishing for the soul, because gardens can be extremely therapeutic for children who have gone through great trauma.
Thérèse, welcome to the Shades of Life podcast. Very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me, Ingrid. It's lovely to be here.
So for people who would be new to the podcast, a reminder that the mission of Scarlet Red Magazine and the Shades of Life podcast is to tell the stories of global change makers dedicated to social and environmental advancement in order to inspire a wider community. One of our 4 pillars is about serving the world with a philanthropic approach. And today with you, Thérèse, we are sharing the story of your global charity called OnePlate. And it is dedicated to fund sustainable food projects in Africa and Asia. And we are going to hear from you about it today. To start, because we are actually not so acquainted, so let's get more acquainted with you. Could you tell us a bit about you? Where are you in the world at the moment? Where are you from? What is your background overall?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Ingrid, for having me. It's really lovely to be here. As you probably may know through my accent, I'm from Australia, and I grew up in a small little country town near Melbourne in the state of Victoria. But currently, right now, I'm in the UK. So I've been based in the UK for this year, but we'll be back in Australia in a couple of months. So I grew up in a beautiful little country town, and my background is in public relations, actually. And I've actually lived in London for a couple of years, many years ago, and traveled to many countries and lived throughout the world over the years. So love travel, and a lot of my past and background is centered actually around travel.
Fantastic. Yes. I love Globetrotters in spirit. We've actually had a number of guests from Australia on the podcast, and it's always a pleasure. I'm getting used to the accent.
Yes.
I hope people are getting used to my French accent as well.
Oh, yes. I love the French accent. You can say my name correct, because my name is actually French.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very rare to find Australians who can actually say my name the French way. So I love how you say it. The proper French way with the accents.
So obviously your work is dedicated to charity work. So first question I wanted to ask you, have you always been attracted and involved with the charity sector? What has been your journey when it comes to supporting charities?
Yes, I've always been I grew up in a household that was very philanthropic. My parents would always be sharing, ever since I was little, they would always be sharing with us stories, inspirational stories of people around the world who were in need, who needed help, and people who were providing opportunities to help and empower others who were less fortunate. So it was very much part of my background growing up of seeing the greater need beyond myself. And so having, I suppose, that bigger vision um, of the needs of others and growing up in a household with parents who were really teaching us the virtues of love and kindness and generosity and living a life not for ourselves but for others. It was very much embedded into our formation, into our hearts, into our minds, and into our actions growing up. So from there, from when I was young, we were always donating to different charities or different volunteering at different things. And then when I studied public relations, I actually did a couple of internships and had a few positions working with charities, um, which gave me a really good understanding of how the charity sector works.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that it has been part of your upbringing and values. That's really beautiful. So, One Plate, your charity, is also a very beautiful charity. Could you tell us how the idea came to create it? What's the birth story of One Plate?
Yes. Well, OnePlate, I'll start off by saying I am a big dreamer. I have lots of ideas and lots of dreams, but starting a charity was never on my dream list at all. So starting OnePlate wasn't something that I had planned or had thought of or dreamt of. It's something that actually just evolved and was meant to be, obviously. I think that's sometimes the wonderful things in life, how things we don't necessarily plan for it. It's not necessarily on our dream list, but then something touches our heart and it evolves into something. And that's exactly what happened with One Plate. So I nearly 10 years ago next year, I had started a new job in public relations and I had heard about this foundation in Manila in the Philippines that needed some volunteers to help out. So, long story short, I went over, it was actually through the inspiration of my dad. I went over to Manila to volunteer at this foundation that cares for street children. And it was my first time that I had ever been to the Philippines. And what was interesting is the year before that, I was actually in London at a leadership conference. And I'll just never forget one of the speakers on stage. She was talking about the 145 million orphans around the world. And I remember just sitting in my chair listening to this lady speak and just so completely overwhelmed by that statistic. I couldn't believe it. 145 million orphans. I had never heard, I had no idea there were that many. And the next thing that she said is she just posed a question. And her next thing that she said, it's never left me. And it was something that just struck my heart in that moment. And she just said, how will they know that they're loved? And when she said that, there was something that I just got a bit teary. I was like, how will they know that they're loved? 145 million orphans. And as I sat there, the statistics so overwhelming. And then that question, how will they know that they're loved, is so overwhelming that it was just actually too much to think about. Where do you even start? It was just quite overwhelming, yet it really touched me deeply to tears. So it was something that I thought of, but just sort of put away because I didn't even know where to start with that. And then I found myself exactly 1 year later standing on the streets of Manila, volunteering at this foundation that cares for street children. And Ingrid, I'm not sure if you've been to the Philippines
Oh,
or if,
I've never been there.
yeah. So just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land there, in Manila, there are tens of thousands of children living on the streets and they just spend their days loitering the streets searching for food to survive that day. And they estimate there's anywhere up to 1 million children who are living on the streets. And once these children are on the streets for so many different reasons, some are orphans, some have actually been abandoned by their families. Some have run away from home because home is actually worse than the streets. And many are from the slum areas. And then once they're on the streets, they get involved in gangs and alcohol and drugs and child trafficking. And it's just this vicious, horrible, horrendous cycle. And their number one goal is just to find food for that day. And so they're in survival mode. And I couldn't believe what I saw. And this is a 10-hour flight from Australia. And Australia, I mean, there's poverty in Australia, but absolutely nothing compared to what I saw. We don't have 2-year-olds sleeping on the street. And so it was quite heartbreaking and sad to see this. And probably one of the most saddest things that I saw were a lot of these children. We actually encountered these, there were about 10 boys and they were between 8 and 12 years of age, and they were all high on drugs. And I thought they were on drugs because they were involved in crime. But the reason why they're on this drug is to actually numb their stomachs from hunger. So they sniff this, it's a glue, it's like a solvent. They sniff this glue, it numbs their stomach, and then they don't have hunger pangs. And then they become addicted to this glue, and then it obviously causes all of these other problems. And just to see that, it was just obviously so devastating. But this particular foundation that I was volunteering at, every Saturday they open up their doors and they provide a feeding program and provide lunch for the children. And they've been doing this for over 20 years now. And so they welcome 500 children off the streets and feed them lunch. So they needed help with this feeding program, which is why I thought, oh, that's easy. I can go along and just do help with whatever they need. So I went along on the Saturday, and I thought it would be just like a normal feeding program, like a soup kitchen where the children would stand in a line with their bowls and they would get fed rice out of these big pots, and then they would find a little place on the concrete floor, sit down and eat their bowl of rice. But what actually happened was so different from what I had imagined. The children all come in the morning, they do games, they sing. Sometimes they have dentists come in and do teeth checks, and hairdressers who come in and do their hair. And then the children all just play. And then at lunchtime, they send all the children outside, and this area, which is not that big, but it's a concrete floor, tin roof, they transform this room into a dining room. So they get trestle tables and they put tablecloths down and beautiful centerpieces, and they set up every place individually with cutlery and plates and napkins and cups. And it's simple, but it's so beautiful the way they set up the table for these children. And I was so touched by this. And as I was in charge of putting the spoons down, so I was putting down 500 spoons, and I put down one of the spoons. And one of the spoons was slightly crooked, just on the angle a little bit. And one of the long-term volunteers came over and he straightened it up. Oh. And I thought, oh, he's got OCD. There's 500 spoons and it's slightly crooked and he's straightening it up. And he just looked at me and he said, we need to make it perfect because we want to treat these children like little kings and queens. And I was like, wow, that's so beautiful, because if the King and Queen of England walked through the door, we would be polishing that cutlery, we'd be making it look perfect. And these children deserve just as much respect and dignity as any king or queen, because these are little kings and queens. And so the way they were treated with so much dignity, and those children, because of that, felt the value of their worth. And so I went out the back to help with the food. And what they actually do is plate up every meal like a work of art. So the founder, he's a bit of a chef, creative genius, and he's at the front of the Congo line. And it was a simple meal of chicken, chips, rice, eggs, and he was just placing the food to make it look really beautiful on the plate. And then everybody in the line copied. And so I was in charge of putting the tomato sauce on the eggs. So I had the tomato sauce bottle and I was just squeezing it on the eggs. And he came up to me, he's like, no, no, don't do it like that. He said, do it in a heart shape. Put the tomato sauce on the egg in a heart shape because we want the children to feel loved. And for me, it was just in that moment where I remembered back to that lady on stage in London at that leadership conference when she said, how will they know that they're loved? And it just reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, which is to do small things with great love is a great thing. And honestly, it was the smallest thing. It's a heart shape with tomato sauce on an egg. I mean, these children need everything. Like they need healthcare, education, clothes, food. And I'm doing tomato sauce in a heart shape on an egg. But it reminded me that it is in all those small little details to show these children that they're loved. And it just really struck me that this foundation, they've been going for over 20 years now, and every little detail is there to show them that they're loved. And then we came out, we brought the meals out to the children, we served them, they sat down and we waited on them and they just sat up a little bit straighter. They had smiles on their face and they felt loved in that moment. So through that whole experience, I just started thinking back to our food culture in Australia, how we love going out for breakfast and lunch and dinner and drinks, and how we're living in this golden age of the foodie.
Yeah.
And I thought we shouldn't feel guilty about that because it's a beautiful part of our culture. It builds friendships, it builds community. It's part of the fabric of our community and our life, and building those relationships together. And if we start feeling guilty about that and start rejecting that beautiful part of our culture, then people can either get really bitter, they can become quite judgmental with one another and judgmental with themselves. And it just leads down this spiral that actually isn't healthy for anybody. And people then just become paralyzed and they don't even know what to do. So it's easier not to think about what's happening on the other side of the world. So I just thought, I don't even want to go into that whole conversation. And so I just thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we partner with the hospitality industry and celebrate our beautiful food culture and elevate it for impact, elevate it to make a difference in order to raise money to help feed these children. And so that's where the idea of OnePlate began.
So, such a beautiful, touching story. Thank you so much for giving the backstory and how you came to creating OnePlate. It is so touching, incredible what we are doing in the Philippines as well. So, if you had to summarize your mission in a few sentences only, what would it be, Thérèse?
Well, the mission of OnePlate, our vision is to nourish and enrich children in the greatest of need. So our mission is partnering with restaurants, cafés, and chefs to fund sustainable farms and food projects for children who have either been living on the street, who have been abandoned or orphaned, and providing good, nourishing food for them.
Yeah, so that makes the link perfectly with what you've just shared with us. Really beautiful. So I want to say that we are recording this podcast in the week of World Hunger Day, which wasn't planned, to be honest, but sometimes there are no coincidences. You know, that's what's the same you told me, like you were never planning to create OnePlate. You know, things happen. So one of the 17 UN, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is SDG 2.0 hunger. Could you share with us any statistics around food hunger across the world that would be relevant, obviously, to your mission, to give us an idea of what we are talking about? I actually really love the statistics you gave us about the number of orphans around the world. I had no idea myself, so thank you for sharing this with us as well.
Yeah. Well, it's estimated that there's 45 million children that suffer severe malnutrition. And in 2023, it was estimated that there's 345 million people across the world that suffer hunger. So it's obviously these statistics are huge. Like 45 million, that's severe malnutrition. And I think that's part of the thing that we can become quite overwhelmed by the statistics, which actually does paralyze us from going, we can't, how can you even make a dent into that 45 million? And that's hunger. And those children who are suffering, 45 million suffering from severe malnutrition, they need also healthcare and education and the housing. And there's so many other elements. So it's very easy to look at that, become so overwhelmed and think, and it's easier not to think about it. And that's why with One Plate, for us, it's so important to look at the one and then one more and then one more. And that's part of the reason why we called it One Plate, because when we went out and served those lunches on the plate, for me, that's when I realized that for those children, that's the first time the whole week that they're getting served a meal on a plate. The rest of the week, they're looking for food out of bins or plastic or wherever they can find it. And the plate gives them dignity, but it's one plate and then one more. And that's focusing on the one, I think, is very important. And I mean, just to give you an example of that, on that particular day when we were doing the feeding program, there was a young boy who was standing in the corner just watching, and he would have been about 19 or 20 years of age. And I thought, oh, perhaps he's one of the volunteers. And he was sort of standing there and he looked a bit sheepish and he had a big oversized suit on that was probably 3 times too big for him. And he had a big backpack on. And I went over to him and I introduced myself and I said, oh, are you one of the volunteers? And he said, no. He goes, I'm not. He goes, I'm just visiting today. He goes, I used to come here every day, every week for my one meal of the week. I used to be one of those children. I would live on the streets and on Saturdays I'd come here to have lunch. And today I've come back to say thank you. And he said, I'm now at university and I'm studying engineering. And his whole life has changed because of that one meal a week. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but that one meal led to other things. So I think that just going back to your point about the statistics, it is very overwhelming. They're big statistics. But then when I think of that boy who used to go there for one meal once a week, and now he's at university studying engineering, how that changed his life.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for sharing this message, because you're absolutely right. I think it's important to know what the generic statistics are so that you understand the size and the urgency of the issues. But as you say, when people see them immediately, you have a sense of overwhelm because, you know, the issues are so big. And this is, as you say, when we need to bring it back to, okay, concrete action, grassroots action. And I love these concrete stories. I actually always ask my guests to tell concrete stories of what they do or people they support to really bring it to life, because at the end of the day, this is what matters. And I love this story of this young person who is studying to be an engineer, because we've seen this, and I'm trying to tell these stories on the podcast. We've seen so many people who started from nothing, and I've experienced this in my family as well, and who went to create wonderful lives and also supporting and giving back to people, which is like, you know, the summum of what can happen. So just for this person to say how grateful he was to have this support, it tells everything about your mission that you are doing. So thank you for this, Thérèse. Also, on this podcast, we are aiming to give value to people who would want to mirror what you are doing. So my next question, I know you pioneered the idea of One Plate and you told us the story, but I think you are 4 co-founders in total, if I'm right. Have you all worked together from the start? And I wanted to ask you, how does it work between all of you? Do you have different roles? How do you distribute the responsibilities?
Yes. So, well, what happened after that trip in Manila? I had that first trip in 2015. So I had the idea and I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to partner with our hospitality industry to celebrate our beautiful food culture, raise money to help feed these children? But whilst I was thinking about this, I was thinking, we don't want to just hand out food packages because that will help the children today. But what about tomorrow? What about next week? How can we really help them long term? Which is why we thought sustainable food projects and farms and rooftop gardens would be great. So what happened in relation to your question was, whilst I was there on that trip, I noticed at this foundation they had a big concrete roof. And I said to them, oh, you could do a rooftop garden up there. And they said, we would love to. That's been our dream. We've always wanted to do a rooftop garden, but we can't afford it. And I said, oh, I could go back to Australia, raise the money, and then you can do it. So I went back to Australia and asked a few friends to come on board, raised the 5,000 Australian dollars, sent it back. They built a rooftop garden, which is still flourishing today, 9 years later. And then I went back to Australia and I asked 3 of my good friends if they would come on board to help me launch OnePlate. And these friends are now my co-founders, and they've got skills that I don't have, which is great. So it all complements. And together we launched OnePlate officially in 2016. So they mainly focus on the finance, governance, legal side. I'm more the creative, visionary, PR, comms, marketing, the cookbook, which we'll probably get into a bit later. And yeah, bringing this cookbook together. So that's more my side of it. And then, they focus on the technical side. And Josh does a great job with all of our website. Regina does all of our finance and governance, which is huge for a charity. And that's great for me because that allows me to continue the vision and creative side.
Right, yes, so that's a very complementary team. So, as you said, you've existed for almost 10 years. So you've definitely followed through with the idea of OnePlate, which is great. I wanted to ask you, how did you concretely get started with a charity? So was it with this rooftop project? And also overall, would you say it's been a smooth start or a more challenging one? How would you describe it?
Well, it's evolved, which has been so interesting to see. And just so all the listeners know, we are all volunteers. So nobody gets paid a wage. So we do it all in our free time. And 100% of every donation goes directly to our projects. So that means we can only move as fast as our time because we are all volunteers. So that's definitely one of the challenges is the amount that we can put into it. So in my mind, I've got so many more ideas and it's so much further ahead. So that's definitely one of the challenges. But we really wanted to keep it so that 100% of every donation does go to all the projects. And I think that's made it sustainable long term. That's why, I mean, the idea, it's nearly 10 years next year. So it's kept going. We've stood the test of time now. I'm trying to remember, sorry, what was the question? The challenges. So I lost my train of thought.
I think you've answered it with, definitely time is always a challenge, especially when it's a non-profit. I see that quite often. So, no, that's great, Thérèse. Thank you for...
Actually, sorry, what I was going to say is how it's evolved. And I think that's a really important thing because often I think it's really important, particularly in something like this, we have the vision and we know what we want the outcome to be like, but not to hold on to that too tight, to keep it loose, to allow it to evolve into what it's actually meant to be. Because when I first had the idea and when I first started at OnePlate, our original business model is not what it is now. And if I had have stayed on that and held on to it so tight, I wouldn't be here launching a cookbook in the UK. So our original business model, which we still do a little bit of, is where restaurants and cafes come on board, they choose one menu item, and each time that menu item is ordered, $1 is donated to OnePlate, and we use 100% of that dollar to fund our sustainable food projects and farms. And that was definitely a great idea and a great model, but it required a lot of time to get those restaurants and cafes on board and a lot of manpower that we didn't have at the time because we're volunteers and we've got limited resources. And then it evolved into the cookbooks.
That's great. So would you say, because I wanted to ask you about your fundraising and how it works, because fundraising is always, the big elephant in the room for any charity. So would you say these partnerships with the hospitality sector, is it the root of your fundraising and how it works?
Yes, yeah. So that original business model, definitely, where we would partner with those restaurants and they would choose one menu item. We still have a few cafes that do that, which is amazing. And it's something that we want to continue on with. And to just give you an example of that model of how it's worked so beautifully, one of the ways it worked in such a lovely way was we had this amazing cafe in Melbourne come on board in 2019. And they chose on their menu item, they chose their fish and chips. And every time somebody ordered fish and chips, $1 would be donated to OnePlate. And they're still part of OnePlate. And up to this date, which includes all the lockdowns, they have sold 27,000 plates of fish and chips. So we've raised $27,000 from that cafe just because 27,000 people decided to order fish and chips. So that $27,000, 100% of that has gone into our farm in Manila. We now have a farm with that foundation, a 10-acre farm that's producing food for that feeding program. And they've been able to fund these amazing projects on the farm because of people ordering fish and chips. And I think that really summarizes the beautiful partnership and original vision of OnePlate of celebrating our beautiful food culture whilst making a difference to these lives of these children through a really long-term sustainable way through these farms. So that's definitely one fundraising model. But our other fundraising model, which is the main one that we focus on, is cookbooks. So in 2020, we launched our very first cookbook, which was called Brunch in Melbourne. And as some of your listeners may know, brunch in Australia is a big thing. Everybody loves going out for brunch. And especially in Melbourne, we've got some amazing cafes. So I asked 100 of Melbourne's best cafes to come on board. They gave us their favorite brunch recipe. And together we created a beautiful cookbook called Brunch in Melbourne and launched it in May 2020. And I had a big event planned and ready to launch this book, but obviously everyone knows why that event didn't go ahead. But it turned out to be the best year to launch a cookbook because everybody was at home cooking and wanting to buy more cookbooks. So it ended up becoming a bestseller. We sold out of the first print run, the second print run. We're up to our fourth print run with Brunch in Melbourne. And because of that cookbook and partnering with these 100 restaurants and cafes, we were able to sell so many cookbooks, which has now funded 30 projects throughout. We've got projects. So we now have projects in the Philippines, Cambodia, Kenya, and Uganda, 30 projects across those countries because of the sale of that cookbook, Brunch in Melbourne. So then 2 years ago, I thought, I wonder what brunch in London's like. And it turns out what we've seen in London's amazing. So I thought, wouldn't that be incredible to do a cookbook in London, Brunch in London? And so that's why I'm here in London to launch our cookbook, Brunch in London.
Yeah, and that's how I came across you. That's so amazing, Thérèse. And I just told you before we started recording this podcast, I worked for Le Creuset for over 20 years. And I collaborated with celebrity chefs in the UK, everybody from Tom Akins to Anna Jones, Tommy Banks, Sabrina Gaillou, you name it. And it's so great to see you partnering with these chefs and the hospitality industry here as well as you did in Australia, and to see them jumping on the cause. Like I love the example you gave us with the fish and chips dish, raising money every time someone orders it. What a simple but powerful idea to raise money for a charity. A restaurant can add £1 so easily to a dish, and then they can even advertise it. I would be someone, having brunch at a restaurant. I see this. What a wonderful idea. It's such a good idea to fundraise for your charity. I absolutely love it. So do you work with the hospitality industry mostly in Australia and the UK? Is it how it works today?
Yes, yeah. So we have our cookbook in Australia, and then this cookbook brunch in Melbourne. It's taken 2 years to create. It's 2 years, a labor of love. I don't have a copy right here to show, but we partnered with 100 of London's best restaurants and cafes. We've got some unbelievable chefs and cafes and restaurants that all submitted amazing brunch recipes, from Pophams to Honey and Co, Claridge's, the Ritz. It's a huge variety of venues. And
I've
then
seen Jamie Oliver in one of your pictures as well, right?
there's Jamie Oliver, Ottolenghi, Anna Jones came on board.
Oh, she's so lovely. Yeah.
Heston came on board. Phil Curie, who's the head pastry chef of Harrods. So amazing chefs, restaurants, and cafes that have all united together to make a difference simply by giving us their favorite recipe. And then we had an amazing food photographer, Georgia Gold, and an incredible food stylist, Emily Ezekiel, who cooked, styled, and photographed the whole cookbook, actually in Anna Jones's food studio, Narrawee.
Oh, so nice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how we did the
Yeah.
whole show.
Yeah. So nice. So we will put a link to the cookbooks in the show notes so people can have a look, because they are absolutely gorgeous. I've looked at the food photography. It's definitely like the best of the best. And so inspiring. And again, it is such a nice way to raise funds for your charity and all the incredible work that you do. So you told us that 100% of the money you raise goes directly towards funding sustainable food projects in developing countries. So could you tell us what parts of the world do you support the most?
Well, it's probably equal with Cambodia, the Philippines, Kenya, and Uganda. So they're the four main countries that we have. We've either got farms, rooftop gardens, avocado orchards, bee projects, fruit and nut tree orchards across those countries. And so every project does look a little bit different. But what we really do is, so we really partner with the locals, with these local foundations, because the locals, they know how to farm. They know how to work their own land. I've got no idea about farming. Our thing is we walk alongside them, and it's basically saying we're able to financially fund them and support them and empower them and walk beside them to give them hope that it's possible and that they can do this. And I've always seen OnePlate really as a two-way charity, that whilst we're able to fund these projects, these children, their stories they're so inspiring. Like these children who have gone through so much, they've got so much to teach us about love, about forgiveness, about resilience. And so I just see it as a very much two-way charity, because
Yes.
whilst we're funding these projects, they're inspiring everyone here. And in fact, in the cookbook, Brunch in London, the cookbook, it's a cookbook, but it's also a coffee table book of stories of hope and inspiration. So throughout the book, we've got stories of our projects and some stories of the children to inspire people.
Oh, so lovely. Yes, I need to have one at home for sure. One question. So how, obviously you are present in different countries, and it's actually nice to see the presence you have overall. How do you identify the projects that you support? Is there any particular way you're doing it?
Yeah, so key relationships are so important for us, where we build a friendship and a relationship with the people on the ground. So for the Philippines, for Manila, it's that initial foundation that I volunteered with. So we did the rooftop garden and now the farm. So we've expanded that with the same project partner. In Cambodia, it was through a friend in Australia, and we were able to start off with pilot projects and then we expanded that with the same partnership. And a similar thing in Africa. So, a friend in Melbourne who is very well connected and started a foundation in Kenya. We were able to work with them closely for a few pilot projects, and then they expanded into Uganda. So, we have the same partnership with that same foundation in Africa for both countries and also Tanzania, actually. So, that's really important for us that um, we're quite selective with our partnerships and we only have a few because we want to put everything into those foundations to develop and expand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's great to hear. I love, yeah, the way you are looking at it, like close collaboration, so the long term, obviously. That's really lovely.
Yeah.
So again, I wanted to be very concrete with you and the work that you do. So I've asked you if you could share with us an example of project you supported both in Africa and in Asia and how it made a difference in people's lives. To really bring it to life for people watching and listening today. So could you share a couple of examples in different countries?
Yes, I can. I can tell you one particular one that actually really inspires me and is actually probably the story that keeps me going in those times where I'm doing one plate nearly full time volunteer and it's just so much work. I think back to this little boy and it inspires me to keep going and think it's all for people like him. So this little boy, he's from Manila, and when he was two, his father was his mother died, and his father was in jail for drugs. So after his mother died, he had nobody to look after him. They were already living in the slum area, and obviously his father was in jail for years, so he couldn't see his dad, and his mum had gone. So he actually just went to the streets, and he started living on the streets from when he was 2 years of age, in a cardboard box on just the footpath, and just surviving it too. And so over the next 10 years, from 2 to 12 years of age, he got involved with other street children in gangs and alcohol and drugs. And he just got very caught up in that whole street culture, which is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, horrific. And then one day when he was 12, he heard about this foundation that I was volunteering at. He heard that they give out, they have a lunch program every Saturday. So he went along to one of the lunches. And so he kept going back every Saturday. He'd go back for lunch. And this foundation were able to find him a beautiful, safe home with a house grandmother to look after him. And they got him a scholarship so he could start going to school. And it was this exact time that we actually had just finished the rooftop garden at the foundation. So he was actually given the responsibility of going up to the rooftop garden every day to plant, to water, to weed the rooftop garden. So every single day he'd go up to this rooftop garden and he would water the plants. And just as a side note, this is one of the reasons why our sustainable food projects are more than just food to eat. It's actually these gardens are nourishing for just not the stomach, but they're nourishing for the soul, because gardens can be extremely therapeutic for children who have gone through great trauma. I mean, gardens are therapeutic for anybody. um,
Yeah.
so this little boy, he would go up there every day, and he came with a lot of anger management problems. He came with a lot of trauma, and he didn't feel safe around adults. So he would go up to the rooftop garden, and that was his safe place. He was around living nature that was growing, and he would feel safe there. So he would start just talking to the plants, and he just loved it. And for a lot of these children, they didn't even know, like he didn't even know that you could grow food. he didn't even realize that a seed can turn into a tomato. So he would start collecting, they would eat, when they were eating fruits and vegetables, they would collect any seeds they could out of these fruit and vegetables and collect all the seeds and then go back out onto the street and find little patches of grass and start planting seeds to grow food. So, I mean, if it sometimes it might grow, sometimes it won't, but it wasn't the point. It was the fact that they were starting to learn the process of nature, the process of growing. And he started learning that a seed can turn into a tomato, a seed can turn into vegetables, and that with care, with water, that it can grow. And he started to learn leadership skills that he needed. He had a responsibility that he had to go up there every day to water it for these plants to grow. And he started to have to learn, he would have to learn the virtue of patience, that it would take time for this seed to turn into a tomato. And so learning these skills of life lessons, of patience, of leadership was so important. And then it was this safe space where he felt he could just be. And he would actually let out a lot of his frustration and his anger. So going up to the rooftop garden after a year or two became quite healing for him. And he just fell in love with this rooftop garden. And this rooftop garden, it's mainly herbs and the garnishings. It doesn't feed 500 children. There's no there's no big vegetables growing from it. It's the garnishings for the food. But it's so much more than that. It really is teaching the children so much. And so from there, he started to have a dream. And he said that his dream was to become a farmer. And for us here, we can think, oh, yeah, that's nice. He's got a dream to become a farmer. But I can't even begin to tell you, for these children who've been living on the street, who are in survival mode, who are all they're focused on is getting food for lunch today, they can't even think about tomorrow. They can't, let alone think about the future, let alone to even have a dream. Dreaming isn't part of their life because they're in survival mode. They can't think about the future. Whereas here in Australia and England, we have the opposite problem. Like we're so far in the future that we can't even live in the present moment. But they're so in the present moment because they're in survival mode that they can't even dream about the future. So for this little boy to have a dream to be a farmer was huge, a huge breakthrough. It was this little seed that he was watching that turned into a tomato. He planted this seed in his heart to become a farmer, which was this dream that was planted in. And the moment he started dreaming, any of these children, the moment they start dreaming, then they get out of survival mode and they start thinking about tomorrow, which is life-changing and transforming. And so to watch his journey and to watch him look after this rooftop garden and watch him grow, it's amazing because this is what it's about. It's teaching, it's providing food for them, but it's teaching them how to grow their own food and teaching them life lessons and planting seeds for dreams for these kids.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful story. I can imagine this roof garden must be his happy place. I mean, it's so easy to visualize through your story. And it's amazing that for a project like this, one child can project himself in the future doing something else than, poverty in the street. It reminds me almost like, abandoned dogs. And it's, perhaps a weird parallel, but, I actually watch a lot of stories of rescued dogs because I love dogs and it's just so touching as well. And at first the dogs have so much fear. And like you described for this child with grown-ups, they don't trust humans anymore in the beginning. And you need to rebuild that trust. And that's what you're doing with these children. You're rebuilding that trust as well. And you're showing them that a different future is possible, which is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Story.
Yeah. It's inspiring. And I think we won't know most of the stories of what happens to these children and where they go in the future long term. But to be able to plant seeds of hope for them now, actually, no pun intended, but to actually plant seeds, it's a real honor and privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah. So I think that was a beautiful example of values that you are hoping to develop through the One Plate charity, because I had seen on your website, you described this so well, that you teach children not only to grow their own food and create sustainable food projects, to provide nourishment, but you also teach them, life lessons on leadership, on patience, on responsibility, on love, etc., as you described. I actually saw myself way back in my childhood because my dad is a botanist. And so, planting these seeds and knowing how to grow food, that was part of my own childhood. So I totally get it in your picture, and how valuable a skill it can be, especially for people who suffer from, malnutrition or don't have enough food. This is when being able to cultivate food where you are matters so much, and when your projects matter so much. Um, One kind of broad question I wanted to ask you, because when it comes to the charity sector, that's something I've heard on a few occasions, and it really resonates with me. So do you consider that helping others to help themselves is a key part of your charity work? It's about developing self-sufficiency. Do you think about that?
Yeah, 100%. And that's why we went down the line of these farms, because there's a lot of charities. There's one big organization that they go in and they hand out food packages in Africa, which is important. Like these people need it for today, but it doesn't actually teach them any skills for the future. It doesn't help them tomorrow or next week. So the self-sufficiency sustainable farms that we have, that's the whole reason we're doing it, because to empower them, because they have all the skills, they know the land better than we do. Sometimes they just need some hope and someone to come alongside them, to walk alongside them, empower them, and fund it, provide that seed funding, so then it gives them a platform and a springboard to go from that. Because everybody, no matter what country you live in, we all need that encouragement, that support, that hope, whether that comes through resources or through actual words of encouragement. Everybody needs it. And so I think for our projects, that's the key reason why we're doing what we're doing in terms of these farms and rooftop gardens.
Beautiful. So when you say sustainable food projects, what do you attach to the word sustainability? Is it about self-sufficiency, or does it go beyond that?
Yeah, it's the fact that these farms will hopefully last generations. And it's obviously the farm itself. So purchasing the land and creating all the infrastructure around that, and getting the bore water running and the fencing. And there's so much within that farm of infrastructure. And then obviously all the crops and livestock. But it's also the skills that are being passed on to the next generations that will continue. So as part of some of our projects in Africa, it's connected to a skills training center where young people can come in and learn the skills of farming and growing their own food through the local farmers there. And so that's part of the whole sustainability in terms of, we're just not handing out food packages, but they're getting crop every year, but it's also handing over the knowledge and the skills from generation to generation.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love the continuity message, and that's embedded into what you do. That's really beautiful. So the next question to you, Thérèse, is a really interesting one, and we could probably spend the whole podcast about it. But I wanted to ask you, how do you see the significance of food overall? Because we know obviously it is a basic human need, and we should all have access to it. Food and meals have a profound significance across cultures in many ways. And with the story of OnePlate, what are your own reflections when it comes to food overall?
I think food, as we all know, is so important to our culture, to our communities, because food really is that uniting factor that brings us together. It we have food for celebrations, for key milestones, key moments in our life. And food is survival as well. And I think often for so many people around the world where food is scarce and we don't have much food, they don't have much food, um, and they're looking for food constantly, it becomes their whole life is focused around finding food. And then we can see here in other areas where food is, there's an abundance of it to the point where we don't even think twice about food wastage. And so I think trying to bridge it, because I think a huge narrative that's been played into this whole food world is guilt of people constantly either making other people feel guilty through what we have and what others don't have. And I really just I don't think that helps anybody. So I think being able to build that bridge between celebrating what we have, enjoying what we have, but not but looking at it as an absolute gift. And I think when we look at it as a gift, the food that we have, then that helps us to look at it through the perspective of not food wastage, rather than looking at it through the perspective of the lens of guilt. We do it with a different intention, but looking at it through the lens of gratitude and thankfulness and hope, then we can, through the little things that we do each day, limit our food wastage. Because I mean, food wastage here in the West is unbelievable.
I think it's a third of the food that is
And
produced.
then, and then looking at ways in how we can help create messaging around food wastage. But then in these countries, looking at different programs of what we can do to support that, whether it's through charities or, I mean, OnePlate is just a small piece in the whole pie of it all. But I do feel that these doing sustainable farms and these projects are really important for the long term. And I mean, there's so many, we could talk for days about it, but there's so many different issues and problems in the food ecosystem. And I mean, in particular, Africa. Just to give you one example, somebody I know quite well in Australia, the gap that he found was in some countries in Africa, there was enough food. They were providing enough grain for the year to feed everybody in the local villages. But the problem was they didn't have the proper storage. And so all the insects and different animals would be constantly eating it. So they didn't have enough from their harvest to last the whole year. So he just went in and partnered with a few different organizations and was able to build proper food storage facilities. And that's helped over 5 million families just through creating these food silos so the insects can't get in and their crop can last over a couple of months or year to feed those families. So it's such a simple solution because they had enough food to feed the locals, but it's just not the right storage for it. So I think there's a lot of solutions. And I think we can make things a whole lot more complicated than they actually are. And research is really important, but there can be a lot of research papers written about research papers about written about research papers, and it can just go on and on and on when there are actually simple solutions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your examples. I think sometimes, we need to go beyond, donating food, as you said, and look at the whole ecosystem in which people live, because that's as important, and the infrastructures they have. There are beautiful organizations, charities dealing with food waste. Olio is one in the UK that I want to mention because it's been some years. We are doing wonderful work with you. When I was preparing this podcast, I automatically thought of, it's just been Thanksgiving in Canada very recently, and it will be in the US next month. And then we are going towards Christmas. And, there is this kind of message around being grateful for the food we have and for what you do. As you said very beautifully, I think you're really giving a different value to food because you provide it to people who don't have enough. And as you say, the message of having only one plate of food per week, it's like, wow, powerful with all its meanings. So thank you so, so much for that. So a couple of questions to finish, Thérèse. I wanted to ask you, how significant has OnePlate been in your life for the past 8 years? What does it mean to you personally?
Oh, yes. It's been huge actually because I've put in a lot of time to getting it started and to getting the message out there and creating it. It's been basically a full-time project where I have put my heart and soul into it. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, it wasn't something that I had expected to do, but it sort of makes sense that with everything that I had been taught and learnt growing up, and this desire to want to help in a small way, to be able to pour that into something like this, it's a real honor and privilege to be able to serve and to be able to love these children in this way. And although I don't have direct contact with the children often, I go and visit our projects once every year. I suppose I can see how I can use my talents and my gifts through creating OnePlate and raising our money and raising the money and um, bridging it between the hospitality industry and our projects, using my talents and gifts to be able to serve and love these children. And I just think, yeah, what I get to do this, what an absolute privilege and honor. So it has been a really important project that I have loved being able to do over these last 8, 9 years.
Yeah, yeah, it always makes such a difference when you lead a very purposeful life, right? Even if you don't earn money, you earn so much more than money, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So you touched base a little bit on this, but what are your plans for the future with the charity, even if it might be the immediate future? Is there anything you would like to bring up?
Well, for our projects, we definitely want to continue to expand those in the Philippines, Cambodia, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. But the only way we're able to expand those projects is through raising the money. And the main way we're raising the money is through the cookbooks. So initially, my first main thing that I'm all focused on is selling our cookbook Brunch in London. So we printed 20,000 copies of this cookbook Brunch in London. And if we sell them all, we'll raise £500,000 for our projects, which is 1 million Australian dollars, which would be amazing. But it's cookbook sales are hard in the UK because it's a saturated market. So
You love cookbooks though, so we'll definitely help you promote the cookbook.
yes, we need to sell these cookbooks. And so once we sell those cookbooks, we'll be able to do more projects. And then we hope to do another cookbook in 2 or 3 years' time, which would be Brunch in New York. But first, we need to sell Brunch in London.
Of course, you've got to do brunch in New York.
Yeah.
That's so lovely. So, Thérèse, as you said, you are someone very creative. I always end this podcast with the same question as people bring their own color, vision, and mission to it. If you were a color, what would it be and why?
Oh, I love this question. I mean, I love all the different colors. There's so many beautiful colors. It's hard to narrow it, but a color that I absolutely love is that rose terracotta pink. And I think part of the reason why I love that rose terracotta pink is for me, when I see it, it embodies love. And for me, it all comes back to love. It is all about love. Love is what drives me in my life. It drives me in my mission. And so, yeah, that color represents love for me, but it also represents warmth and kindness and also generosity, and it's a creative color. And I think also, yeah, when I see that color, I think of flowers and nature, and I love being in nature and It's very calming. So yeah, rose terracotta.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah,
I like
it,
this green as well.
it's like an antique rose. Yeah, it would go very well with the green. You have
Yeah.
actually have the color of love. That's beautiful. So, Thérèse, we are coming to the end of this podcast, and it was such a pleasure to have you today and for you to share the story of OnePlate and what it means concretely in supporting children in need across the world. It is such a beautiful mission. If people want to discover more about the charity or get in touch with you, for example, if it's a restaurant, a cafe who would like to support the One Plate mission, where can they go?
Instagram is the best. So our Instagram handle is at OnePlate, ONEPLATE.co. So Instagram to find out all the latest information. Our website, we sell both cookbooks on the website, or you could buy the Brunch in London cookbook on Amazon as well.
Perfect. So we will put these links in the show notes. And thank you again, Thérèse. It was such a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ingrid. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for watching and listening.
When it comes to you